So let's say you found a skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Before we really get into this, you might notice that I'm kind of a bee. Well, that's in part because people voted for it, but the reason I had a bee person hanging around ready to be in this video is because of a little thing called the World of Colony by Hexahedron Studios. I am not getting any money from them or any other reimbursement, and they don't even know that I'm doing this. Giving them a shout out, that is. Anyway, check out their YouTube channel for excellent digital paintings and really cool music to do with their world-building project all about bug people, where the biology of insects is actually taken into account. Now that that's out of the way, I guess it's time to talk about Dan Biddle. When last we looked at Dan Biddle's appearance on Kent Hovind's YouTube channel, Dan was about to dive into Genesis 7, verse 11, which, much to my disappointment, isn't about slushies and scratch tickets, or items that are only stocked so that the store can advertise that parents on food assistance can use said food assistance there, and that are never actually sold, like blocks of frozen juice concentrates that I know firsthand are usually a year or more expired. To my non-American viewers who do not know what I'm going on about, don't worry too much. 7-Eleven is a store in the USA, although it does exist in some other countries. Anyway, let's see what a verse that only makes sense if the Earth is a flat disk with a dome over it surrounded by a cosmic ocean has to tell us about why this flood super duper really happened, you guys. I'm totally serial.
First of all, we see here that it's not written like a mythology book.
It literally has a god flooding a flat Earth by opening windows in the dome he placed over the Earth to keep out the waters of chaos. I'm not sure how much more mythological it could possibly get.
It's written like a history book in the 600th year of Noah's life.
Here's a fun fact: the line between mythology and history isn't drawn based on whether or not the text gives dates.
And we're going to spend time at the end of our talk talking about exactly how those guys would live so long back there. We have some really good statistical evidence of exactly why that happened.
First, I highly doubt that. Second, last time I saw him make an argument like this, his whole argument was that the ages fit into an exponential decay curve really well, which, isn't evidence it's real. It's evidence that if it were real, whatever was causing the decline in lifespan caused exponential decay. Or it's evidence that the authors of the text kind of like to have people dying younger by about the same percentage in each generation. They were mostly making up.
And he says, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the fountains or the windows of heaven were open. So
put your predictions for how he interprets floodgates of heaven in the comments. If you get it right, then you win 2 internets.
What is going on here? The key is that the flood started on the ocean floor.
Not according to Genesis 7:11. Earth was taking it from both ends like Dan's mom, according to the text. Both from the heavens and the oceans, since that's probably where the authors would have located the fountains, since otherwise, how did all that ocean water get there?
And then it didn't peak until about 150 days into the flood.
Again with the weird use of zenith. I mean, it's not the worst thing, it's just super weird to me.
And the whole of Earth was covered. 15 cubits upward did the water prevail, which is about 22 feet by a conservative estimate. So wasn't a local flood.
I'll agree that the text, if taken literally, does indicate a global flood, but that doesn't mean there was a global flood, and it also doesn't mean that you have to take the story literally, or even that it was meant to be taken as such by the authors and the first audience to whom it was written. We know there certainly was no such flood that occurred, so if you want to maintain that the account is in some way historical, you're going to have to allow this verse to be hyperbole. There really aren't any other options that don't just leave you as definitively wrong if you want to accept the historicity of the story.
Was a whole swamp the earth a global flood?
You know, at first I wondered why he even bothered, since I know what his claim is, but then I realized he's not just arguing that this claim is correct based on the evidence, he's arguing that it's the correct claim to make based on the Bible. And the reason I don't care is that this talk isn't for me. It's not here to convince non-creationists. It's here first and foremost to keep young Earth creationists being young Earth creationists, but also secondarily to convince sympathetic Christians who are on the fence that he has the correct theological position.
Here's a short animation we're going to show of not a guess theory, but I'm going to say we actually know how it happened. We have the physical evidence.
That's a big claim. I wonder if he can back it up.
Of how these fountains of the great deep breached and broke open. It's actually quite obvious still on Earth today, and I'm going to show you what that looked like next. So
Weird how we seem to be just ignoring the floodgates of heaven. Those seem important according to Genesis 7:11. In fact, they're one of the 2 sources of water mentioned, and nothing I can see in the text seems to indicate that they're a source of significantly less water than the fountains of the great deep. Do you think he just doesn't want to talk about the fact that the book he thinks is literally true depicts a solid dome with windows in it over the flat Earth?
On the ocean floor, we have this oceanic rift starting as the hot lava comes up, breaches with these big linear underwater rifts, pushes up these linear steam jets that are supercritically heated water, and those are going to send tsunamis and waves all the way up onto the land continents as it's going. So
There are a couple problems with this. First, that doesn't actually add to the amount of water on Earth, because the water that comes up through the deep sea vents was just water from the ocean in the first place. There's no mechanism for a huge amount of bulk water to just appear in a lava flow to get added to the hydrosphere. Second, tsunamis leave behind tsunamite. That's a kind of rock that's recognizable, and Dan thinks this is the event that laid down most of the Paleozoic rock. But most Paleozoic sedimentary rock has not been shown to be tsunamite. Dan sure hasn't done any geology, but even pseudoscientists who do pretend geology for creationists like Taz Walker, Steve Austin, and Andrew Stelling have not to my knowledge ever claimed that they found any tsunamite at all in the Paleozoic, never mind the global deposits that this idea would require.
the underwater, the lava's going to come up, it's going to cool, it's going to turn into new seafloor, then it's going to spread.
Yes, that is how seafloor spreading happens. But we also know what rate it happens at, and the current rate that's measured specifically by measuring how far apart the sides of the Atlantic are drifting each year. This lines up with measurements from radiometric dating, which also line up with the paleomagnetic record from sources within human archaeology, at least within the range of the human archaeological record. We would need some compelling evidence to allow for seafloor spreading at the speed that Dan needs, and of course, this is a source of heat, a lot of heat, but I think we'll hear more about that later.
Then it's going to hit the land continent and dive underneath it.
No, the seafloor that's spreading is not generally the seafloor that's subducting. It's the oceanic crust on the opposite side of the continents from the spreading that subducts. There's a reason that the Atlantic is spreading and the Ring of Fire is around the Pacific. It's because the subduction is around the Pacific, which is shrinking.
And start buckling and folding the land as it goes down. We know that's exactly what happened with the Farallon Plate right off of the coast of California.
That's true.
So, and as it cools and the gods shut the fountains off, the water sheets right back off again.
Okay, but that's not going to get you to a flood. There isn't currently enough water to cause a flood. You need a source of water to enter the hydrosphere and then a way for it to exit the hydrosphere. And while volcanic vents do add water to the hydrosphere, it's only in the very short term, because they also took that same water from the hydrosphere. So there's no net gain. Where did it come from? Where did it go?
Where did you come from? Where did you go? Where did you come from, Cotton Eye Joe?
So that's a quick overview of the mechanism of the flood. We have the hot magma coming up. It creates new seafloor. It spreads from the left to the right. It's going like a conveyor belt. It hits the land, dives underneath it.
Okay, so the mechanism is a version of seafloor spreading, which has never been observed or indicated at speeds that would dump enough heat into the oceans to boil them, which are themselves magically producing supercritical water, which is going to be steam when it hits the air. So Noah is steamed alive. Wow, this sounds like Dan never bothered to actually work out the math for this, or learn anything about geology, or in any way think through the implications of this. He's just making it up as he goes. It's a lot like catastrophic plate tectonics, but at least the CPT people know that the subduction is occurring opposite the spreading, even if they do acknowledge that they have a severe heat problem and absolutely no way short of magic to get rid of it.
And causes tsunamis that are happening in cycles over and over and over again.
That leave no trace at all, which seems super plausible.
And the quick answer to what proves the flood in 30 seconds or less is that we have 14 states where the dead dinosaurs buried in the middle of America, millions of them buried with marine life in a 14-state, 600,000-mile, 300-foot thick pancake of over 600,000 cubic miles in a 300-foot thick mud pancake.
No such pancake exists, whether made of mud or flour, eggs, milk, baking powder, sugar, salt, and butter. What he's describing is just the area in the USA with the most Mesozoic sedimentary rock, which is, where you'd expect to find most non-avian dinosaur fossils, since where else would you find them?
And they're buried in 3 products: mud, sand, and ash.
Weird, because there's also shale in the Aguja Formation, which has dinosaurs. The Austin Chalk of the Gulf Coast has had dinosaurs found in it. It's limestone. The Coon Creek Formation has dinosaur fossils in marl. The Dakota Formation has dinosaurs in shale. The Demopolis Chalk is limestone and contains fossils of Appalachiosaurus, etc. Saying that dinosaurs are buried in mud, sand, and ash as if those were the only kinds of substances in which we've found dinosaurs is just incorrect.
And what you just saw is the only mechanism that's going to explain dinosaur taphonomy, or how these creatures were buried.
Except that it explains virtually none of it, because essentially no dinosaurs are buried in tsunamite. They're buried in things like alluvial sandstone, lacustrine shale, marine limestone, etc. None of that is tsunamite. Taphonomy is already a science, and people spend decades studying it. Tsunamis are the explanation for essentially no dinosaur fossils.
Dr. Baumgartner has modeled this using his computer software.
Yes, he did, and he had to increase the thermal diffusivity of the rocks of Earth by several orders of magnitude in order to get it to work the way he wanted. Thermal diffusivity is a measure of internal heat transfer. Basically, if you put the business end of a metal spatula on the burner of your stove, how long does it take until the handle is also burning hot? It is defined as the thermal conductivity of the substance divided by the product of its density and specific heat capacity. Thermal conductivity is much like electrical conductivity, except that it measures how fast heat transfers rather than how well electricity transfers. Density is, as you probably know, the mass of an object divided by its volume, and specific heat capacity is the amount of thermal energy needed to increase the temperature of a mass of a specific substance by a particular amount. For example, water has a specific heat capacity of 4.184 joules per gram per Kelvin, meaning that it takes 4.184 joules of energy to increase the temperature of 1 gram of water by a single degree Celsius or by 1 Kelvin, which is the same change in temperature. Thermal diffusivity is a property of a substance that does not simply vary. Under the same conditions, the same substance will always have the same thermal diffusivity unless the laws of physics change. Since the laws of physics are what they are, Baumgartner's model is physically impossible based on current scientific understanding.
He got his PhD from geophysics from UCLA over 40 years ago. He came up with the software model, and people are using this to find oil.
Well, kind of. The modeling software is called Terra, and it has been used in a modified form to model plate tectonics by people other than Baumgartner, and it was modified because the original version didn't actually give realistic results. It's not clear what version Baumgartner used, but it is clear that he had to drastically alter the physical properties of the Earth to get his desired outcome. And yeah, if you simulate a version of Earth that isn't the real version of Earth, I'm sure you can get all sorts of weird results. But those aren't applicable to the real Earth, just the fake one that you made up.
It's an amazing thing. It's all based on young Earth creation ideas about Noah's flood.
No, it's not. It's just based on some basic physical parameters and how they interact. Like any simulation, if you put in garbage, you get out garbage. Baumgartner wanted to find a flood, so he put in nonsense parameters to get a flood. And he got a flood. There should be no surprise about this. It doesn't mean anything because it's always been known that if you fiddle around with a simulation, you can get pretty much anything you want.
We had a Pangea-like formation of the continents that used to be together. The fountains of the Great Deep break open, and it began a 40,000-mile linear network of these fissures of the oceanic ridge that goes around the Earth 1.6 times total. There's a 40,000-mile network of these oceanic ridges, or the mid-Atlantic ridges.
And these rocks do not show evidence of having been heated enough. You see, rock moving requires energy, which you probably are not surprised by. When a rock moves, it generates heat from friction, and when the rock stops, all the energy used to move it will be transferred to heat, which means you can figure out how much thermal energy a moving continent would dump into the environment. As an example, the North American plate has a mass of about 40.7 times 10 to the 21st kilograms. The Atlantic Ocean is about 4,800 kilometers across, and the North American plate would have to move about half that distance, or 2,400 kilometers. If we assume that this happens over half a year, that's about 3,383 hours, so we have a speed of 0.7 kilometers per hour, or 0.2 meters per second. So that mass moving at that speed has 4 zeta joules of energy, which is a strange number. So let's put it in terms of how much water you could boil with that if you started with some water at 0 degrees Celsius. It takes water 2,257 kilojoules per kilogram to boil water that's at 100 C. It takes 41.840 kilojoules to take 1 kilogram of water from 0 to 100 degrees Celsius. So to take a kilogram of water from 0 Celsius to steam takes 2,298.84 kilojoules. So now we take 4 zetajoules and we divide it by the 2,298.84 kilojoules per kilogram, and we get 1.74 times 10 to the 15th kilograms of water boiled off the oceans. And that's just one source of heat for one continent. But it gets worse. We can't simply ignore friction. Now, doing an actual full friction calculation would be pretty complex, but we can be generous and say that if a continental plate were accelerated to 0.2 meters per second, it would take about 10 seconds to come to rest. I suspect it's actually much closer to 1 second or less, but hey, I'm being nice. That means that every 10 seconds or so, those same 4 zetajoules are shed to the surface. That means that there are over 1.5 million such 10-second periods in the course of half a year or so. So really, over the course of the flood, a much more reasonable, but still absurdly lowballed figure for the amount of water boiled off would be 2.74 times 10 to the 21st kilograms. Or 2.74 yotograms. Or, almost exactly twice the mass of the entire water on Earth, which is only about 1.4 yotograms. Again, that's just for North America. Eurasia and Africa are even heavier, and we also have South America and Antarctica. This idea would boil the ocean many times over, under even the most generous assumptions. There's no evidence that this heat ever existed, and as you probably know, that is far from the only source of heat that most flood models involve. This idea simply does not correspond to the past of Earth.
And we have the one here, the main one, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge right out in the Atlantic, that has a 10,000-mile strip of where it was cut there.
It wasn't cut.
You can see it's quite obvious how it pushed these two continents apart.
Yes, but it's physically impossible that it did it during the flood year. And we know it didn't because we don't have any evidence of the heat that would have been shed to the rest of the Earth. The only conclusion is that the Atlantic was pushed apart slowly enough that it probably took a few tens of millions of years.
We know that because we can correlate the fossils and the oil chemistry. We can bring these, when you bring those continents back together, right there where they would join at that big baseball seam-like tear, we have things that are correlated, indicating that they used to be together, but they were rapidly spread apart and catastrophically spread apart. You can go to Google Earth and see that today.
We still have these scars, fault lines. I've been to the San Andreas Fault, the Hayward Fault, the New Madrid Fault, the Golden Fault. None of them my fault, but I've been there, done that, studied it, okay? There's no question the Earth has cracks. The question is, when did this happen? Well, the textbooks in school say this is part of the Pangea theory. The continents are moving around. Well, I agree the continents are moving a little bit, but the Pangea theory is baloney. They shrank Africa 40% to make them fit. They took out all of Mexico and Central America. Hey, señor, ¿qué pasa? ¿Dónde está Mexico, Panama, Costa Rica, Guatemala? They don't tell the kids, if you take the water out of the oceans, you'll notice there is dirt underneath. People say, hey, do you think the continents were connected? I say, what are you talking about? They still are. What do you mean, were they? Hello? Always have been connected. They're still connected. What do you mean, were they? Cover more on that on video number 6.
So does Kent still disagree with this? I haven't heard him say so, but he certainly at one point thought that this was nonsense. That's a bit strange that he would just platform something that, as far as I know, he thinks is a lie. It's one of his lies in the textbook.
But here's a bathymetric map on the right, which is just a map with the water taken off. And you can see quite obviously how the fountains of the Great Deep were instrumental in pushing these continents apart.
Except that the fountains of the Tehom, or Great Deep, are openings to a cosmic ocean of water, not a bunch of lava, which is what these mid-oceanic ridges are. You just have to make stuff up and shove it into Genesis in order to say that the fountains are actually volcanoes. We can see that the Great Deep is water and not lava in multiple places in the Bible. We have in Isaiah 51:10,
"Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a pathway for the redeemed to cross over?"
Here the Great Deep is basically just the water crossed in Exodus. In Amos 7:4, we read,
"So the Lord God showed me, and behold, the Lord God was calling to contend with them by fire, and it consumed the great deep and began to consume the farmland."
How does fire dry up lava? It doesn't. Clearly the Great Deep isn't something like a volcano. Jonah 2:5 says,
"Water encompassed me to the point of death. The great deep engulfed me. Weeds were wrapped around my head."
Notice that Jonah almost drowned. He didn't burn to a crisp in lava. Consistently throughout the Hebrew scriptures, the Great Deep is associated with the ocean and water. It's not fire, it's not steam, and in Genesis, the function of the fountains of the Great Deep is just to increase the volume of water on Earth and later to drain it away. Interestingly, this solves the problem of there not being enough water for the flood to happen. although at the cost of requiring a flat Earth cosmology that doesn't even have time zones. So, you win some, you lose some.
So let's look at it a little bit more. So you've got the hot lava that comes up.
Contradicting what we find in Genesis, yes.
It forms new seafloor and it spreads, and it's going to be pushing these two continents apart, for example, at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, but it pushed a lot of the continents apart.
Yep, no one disputes that. The question is, can you cram it into a year or so?
So when that seafloor spreads, it's going to hit the land continent and bind and develop pressure and tension.
No.
Nope. Again, the subduction is going to be on the opposite side of the world, as evidenced by the lack of volcanoes on the east coasts of North and South America and the west coasts of Europe and Africa. But the abundance of volcanoes on the west coasts of North and South America, as well as on the east coasts of Asia and Africa. Like, a simple glance at a map of volcanoes around the world should be enough to show that Dan doesn't know what he's talking about.
Then when it releases, it's going to send a tsunami out to sea and out to land in two different directions. And that was going on every so many minutes during the peak part of the flood, during the first 150 catastrophic days of the flood.
All while leaving behind essentially no tsunami deposited rock. How strange. And of course, animals buried by a tsunami are generally rather shattered. Yet in some cases we find quite intact fossils. The famous fighting dinosaur fossils of a velociraptor and a protoceratops locked in combat were found in air-deposited sand, and the fossils are both essentially intact. How did that happen during a tsunami? Did the tsunami have a gentle air pocket to allow sand to blow into the dunes, only for it to crash down with the force of a feather to prevent the compaction and therefore the damage to the soon-to-be fossils of the Geology formation? That seems rather far-fetched.
We have the seafloor subducting, it's binding, gaining tension, and releasing, and that turned into a tsunami-making machine.
I mean, yes, it still is one. That's how a lot of Pacific tsunamis happen.
That was coming up on the land and burying these creatures in layers, and that's exactly what we see them buried in today.
Layers, yes, but if you leave it there, you're lying by omission. Are they all buried in tsunamite or any other kind of turbidite? No, they're not. No one says that there shouldn't be multiple layers of rock containing fossils. The question is, what can we predict about those rocks? And Dan's idea predicts that all of them will be formed in high-energy deposits, and in some cases, catastrophically high-energy deposits. Instead, they're frequently found in things like tidally cross-bedded sandstone, revealing that it took years or even millennia of tides to form the rock in question, or limestone that accumulates at a few centimeters per millennium, yet is in deposits hundreds of meters thick, or in fine-grained, non-flocculated shale that also has to deposit slowly in low-energy environments. It will be hard for the world to look less like a young one that had suffered a global flood a scant few thousand years ago.
And layers. So, for example, when a subduction-related slip happened in Japan, look at the effect of the tsunami.
Oh no, 25-centimeter waves on the west coast of the Americas. At least he's not pretending that this is the radiation leakage like I saw in lots of memes on Facebook shortly after the tsunami. That was annoying. I can't tell you how many people I had to tell that the scale was in meters and that that's not how you measure radiation.
This was a 60-foot seafloor slip. It had been binding tension for thousands of years since the flood, and then it released. The seafloor slipped about 60 feet. And when it did, over in Japan, we see the effect. That tsunami reached the shores all the way over to the Americas.
I mean, yes, it did reach the Americas, but it was like knee height for most people. That's just going to be kind of a tall wave one day. It wasn't exactly a force of destruction by the time it got to the Americas. Maybe he should have focused on the damage it actually did in Japan, where it was by far the worst.
Spread thousands of miles going over, and of course, it wreaked havoc on Japan.
Oh good, he got there.
Burying hundreds and hundreds of people, and they still can't find many of them. So that's an example of what one subduction-related tsunami can do. But these tsunamis were happening over and over again in like a cycle, in like a mill, just going on for about 150 days during the flood.
Right, no one is disputing that this scenario would have been unbelievably destructive. It's just that there isn't evidence that it happened. So far, literally the only evidence that we've been shown is Dan misunderstanding, if I'm being generous, taphonomy as the stratigraphic column, and John Baumgartner pretending that he can just alter the physical properties of Earth at will in a simulation and therefore learn something about the real Earth. In other words, no evidence at all. Harping on about the destructiveness of the scenario doesn't do anything to help.
And isn't it also interesting that one translation takes Genesis 8:3 and looks at it this way? And the waters receded from the earth, going forth and returning.
The only translation I can find that has this rendition is the Legacy Standard Bible, a translation released in 2021. The NIV says receded steadily. The NLT says gradually receded. The ESV says receded. The BSB says receded steadily. The KJV has returned from. The NKJV says receded continually. The NASB says receded continually. The AB says receded steadily. The CSB says steadily receded. The HCSB says steadily receded. The ASV says returned. The ABPE says returned. The BST says subsided. The CEV says slowly went down. The Douay-Rheims says returned. Other phrasings include began to recede and gradually went down. Literally only one translation says anything about going forth and returning. He's shopping around for a translation he likes because he knows that the other translations don't give his idea of cyclic tsunamis any comfort. So the Hebrew verb is yashubu, which means recede. The other word of significance is halauk. Please forgive my Hebrew pronunciation. This word means to go, walk, or come. So an overly literal translation would be, and the waters receded from the land, going steadily, and the waters decreased at the end of 150 days. There is just nothing about going back and forth, and even the Legacy Standard Bible's translation doesn't actually say that, since forth doesn't mean back and forth, it means forward or outward, but it's archaic. So the only association most people have with it is in the phrase back and forth, meaning backwards and forwards, implying some kind of oscillation. So let's see, the Hebrew doesn't say anything about cyclic tsunamis, none of the English translations do either, and only one obscure translation can even be twisted to kind of indicate that, even though when you actually read it, that's not what it means. Further, Kent is a KJV supremacist, so normally he'd object to someone using another translation to demonstrate a doctrine when that translation contradicts the KJV. Now, I don't actually think it does contradict the KJV, but Dan seems to.
And at the end of the 150 days, the water decreased. Look, I know there's a lot of dispute about Bible translations and different ways of looking at things.
Yeah, there is, and Dan's in the house of a KJV only guy.
But this is a valid translation of Genesis 8, chapter 3.
I agree, it doesn't say what Dan thinks it does. Dan is evidently bad at English, not just Hebrew.
What is it talking about? Tsunamis.
That's a stretch.
Stretch Armstrong.
Literally nothing in that verse in any English translation I can find, or in the Hebrew, in any way indicates that there was a tsunami. In fact, I asked biblical scholar Kip Davis, and he said that the closest he could come to interpreting Genesis 8:3 is that the steady water decrease was actually steady rising and falling in the tides with a net decrease in water. And that's with him trying to find a way to reconcile this interpretation.
Right there in Scripture, we have the water receded from the earth, going forth and returning.
Right, going forth from the land to return to the ocean. This is nothing about the water coming onto land. That already happened earlier in the narrative.
The Scripture itself talks about the fountains of the great deep breaking open. That's a very mechanical explanation.
I mean, it is. It's just that there's no actual great deep that can provide additional water as conceptualized in the Bible.
And here we have yet a second mechanical explanation. The water's going forth, returning, going forth, returning.
That's just a lie, though. He's lying about the Bible. I get it when he lies about the science. He just doesn't care about science. But lying about the Bible? That's the very thing he's supposed to be most concerned with.
And then after 150 days, the waters came down and that tsunami mill was stopped. Remember here.
Yes, remember here that there would be no water. The oceans would have boiled like 10 times over just from the heat generated by the continents spreading apart. And of course, remember that these tsunamis can't deposit many kinds of rocks like we find, such as evaporite, Aeolian sandstone, etc. And we don't have ubiquitous tsunami, and even if we ignore all that, we don't have enough time for the rocks deposited by the flood to lithify in order for the flood runoff to create arches and steep-walled canyons.
You guys, Scripture says that God says, I will destroy them, corrupt humanity, with the earth. So God says, I'm going to use the earth as a tool to destroy humanity. And that's exactly what he did.
And then he made it look like doing so was completely physically impossible and never happened, which is a weird choice. Look, if your argument is that the flood left no physical evidence in biology or geology and no archaeological or cultural impact outside of the ancient Near East, then you can make that argument. I can't say it didn't happen because it's entirely unfalsifiable. But if you want to argue that there is any evidence that would actually lead someone to suspect the historicity of such an event, it's just not there. You have to believe it in spite of the evidence, not because of it. If, on the other hand, you prefer science and non-fallacious reasoning, then why not subscribe to this channel if you haven't already? Make sure to turn on all notifications so sometimes you might actually get a notification. Also make sure to like this video, as that's what really tells YouTube that you want to see more of my content. And not just you, it also increases how much I pop up in the feed of new viewers too. You can directly help the channel grow, and all it takes are some free clicks.
He recycled Earth's surface right underneath. He destroyed it in a very, very catastrophic way.
And in order to show that all Dan has done is give us scenarios in which, in order to believe this, you'll need to simply ignore basic physics and math. And I mean, like, high school algebra. You don't even need logarithms for this, never mind calculus. Just some basic unit conversions, algebra, and some physics equations are all that's needed to show that this simply did not happen.
So let's look at a little bit more closely into the FUD mechanisms and the resulting taphonomy.
Yay for fossils.
Taphonomy is a study of the conditions in which an animal,
Any organism, actually.
was buried and killed and fossilized.
That's true.
So here is the situation that evolutionists are stuck with. It's the most obvious thing in the world. If you have 5 minutes, want to take someone out to coffee and prove the flood, just take the picture of the slide. That's all you need when you understand what's really going on here.
I can't imagine how going to the PaleoDB map and filtering for just Mesozoic dinosaur fossil finds, then taking a screenshot of the continental United States would prove the flood, but let's find out.
This is the middle of America.
I mean, it's actually more to the west than in the middle, at least the part with the most dinosaur finds, but I don't think that's too important.
And we have a 14-state kill zone because every single one of those circles is not one fossil, not 10, not 100. Most of these are fossil bone beds.
That's not entirely accurate.
Actually, each of those dots is a single dinosaur find in virtually all cases, but the dinosaurs are found in a fossil-bearing formation that has other fossils, including other dinosaurs, just at different locations. You can actually check. Sure, some of the dots do represent mass graves, but most don't. You might think that the large circles on the map indicate more finds in a particular location, and that's kind of true, but when you zoom in, you find that they actually are simply more circles, each of which on its own is usually a relatively isolated dinosaur find.
Huge areas and swaths of regions where there's multiple hundreds or sometimes thousands, sometimes tens, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of fossils buried in these areas.
Fossils, yes. Dinosaur fossils, no. An area with millions of fossils will mostly have things like mollusk shells, plants, etc. Most strata with dinosaurs have a lot of other organisms too, and those organisms are usually more abundant than the dinosaurs.
But when you draw an oval circle around it, it's over 1 million square miles, 1,800 miles long, all the way up to Canada and Mexico. It encompasses parts of 3 countries, 14 states, 1,000 miles wide, 1 million square miles.
Wow.
I sure hope he has a point to this.
Of a dinosaur kill zone right in the middle of America.
What a weird way to put that. It's like calling a cemetery a kill zone because you find a lot of bodies there. Organisms die everywhere, and their bodies end up in various places, often not exactly where they died. There's no reason to think that there was something special about this region, besides that it's the part of North America that has the most preserved Mesozoic sedimentary rock. West of it, and we get to mostly relatively new volcanoes, and to the east, you get rocks that have eroded down to mostly Paleozoic rocks capped by Pleistocene glacial deposits from long after the Mesozoic. There had to be somewhere in North America with the most Mesozoic strata. It being in the west and southwest isn't evidence for a flood.
How do you get that without something like catastrophic plate tectonics?
170 million years of geology and biology, that's how. It's not a kill zone. It's just a place where for tens of millions of years dinosaurs lived and died. You can tell because the rocks aren't actually flood deposits, and because, even if they were, we already know that Dan's flood model is physically impossible for many reasons, so the flood rocks would have had to have formed over the course of millions of years anyway.
So here's where the biggest T-Rex was found. Look at all those layers underneath that helicopter.
Something floods don't tend to do. They tend to deposit a single graduated turbidite deposit. So that's a problem for the flood.
Evolutionists say that, maybe it was a Chicxulub asteroid that fell, 2,500 miles away.
Nope, and no one says that. The asteroid couldn't have formed any of those deposits except for the topmost Cretaceous deposits, and we have very few rocks that can be attributed to that event. Although, not none. Essentially, none of these fossils is explained in reference to the asteroid impact. In fact, most of them couldn't be because they were already dead and buried tens of millions of years before the asteroid.
Well, if we drop the rock and drop that Yucatan Peninsula asteroid, the Chicxulub asteroid right there, you've got a little bit of flooding that's going to come up to Texas and Florida and bring tsunamis up maybe 10 feet high, 15 feet high. It's going to cover some parts of the southern states, but you're going to miss the dinosaur kill zone.
Yeah, you will. Although I'd point out that the asteroid hit at the end of the Cretaceous, when much of the area that he calls a kill zone was actually connected to the Gulf of Mexico as part of the Western Interior Seaway, because sea levels were much higher. So in fact, a tsunami would hit most of that area, but even so, it wouldn't cause most of those fossils. Dan is arguing against something no one has ever believed, at least no one in the field.
The evidence shows we have 1 million square cubic miles.
I hate cubic miles. It's such a stupid unit. My advice is to ignore anyone who wants to measure things in cubic miles.
Square miles in the middle of America here.
I'm not a fan of square miles either, but whatever, it's fine.
Covering 14 states, it's nowhere near where the Chicxulub asteroid landed.
Sure isn't, but so what? What do you think Dan would say if I told him that Christianity was wrong because Jesus was crucified outside Jerusalem? But that's really far away from Cincinnati. He'd probably say, so what? And yeah, he should. And that's what you should say if anyone ever tries to tell you that science is wrong because a fossil is far away from the Yucatan. It's completely meaningless.
So these creatures were killed way, way up there through these cycling tsunamis that were happening when the seafloor is subducting, and we've got the tsunamis coming up from the left to the right. They're coming up from California and washing over Oklahoma, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana.
Then why are they found mostly in things like tufaceous sandstone, siltstone, sandstone, much of which is shallow marine, lacustrine, fluvial, or alluvial, which, isn't flood rock or tsunami rock? There is no reason to think that either a global flood or a single asteroid impact is responsible for all these fossils. No one thing is responsible for all these fossils.
Those whole regions, and it's happening because of catastrophic rifting, catastrophic plate tectonics.
Except that while I'll grant that catastrophic plate tectonics might cause earthquakes, it can't cause tsunamis because there would be no ocean left. We already did the math on that. It's like trying to make a wave pool inside of a forge used to make steel. You physically can't do it. Sure, the vibrations needed are easy, but water physically cannot exist in there as a liquid, so it would be on the whole of Earth if Dan were right.
Something's happening that's bringing the ocean waters up from the west and bringing it up east. And
even if we ignore the catastrophic plate tectonics can't possibly make tsunamis, or even happen while there's a flood at the same time, as they're mutually exclusive, it would also be causing the Rockies to rise. They themselves would block tsunamis, limiting their impact further inland. And that remains true even if the tsunamis are higher than the Rockies. Now, a tsunami taller than the mountains wouldn't be entirely stopped by the mountains, but it would still reduce the energy and volume of the water that could cross over the mountain. Has Dan done any analysis to this to see how much the rise of the Rockies would be affecting the tsunamis and vice versa? It seems like it would be a really important aspect of the model building.
Spreading it all over these states in America in order to create that 1,000 square mile kill zone that's 1,800 miles long, 1,000 miles wide. Something else is happening besides an asteroid falling down in Mexico, thousands of miles south from this location.
Right, almost 200 million years of time. That's what's happening.
So the other big key giveaway, and this is a little bit harder to explain, hopefully I'll do a good job with it, but remember how I mentioned the leading proof for Noah's flood in my mind, the most obvious proof, is that these creatures are buried in 3 products: ash, mud, and sand.
And silt and clay and so on and so forth. But yeah, sedimentary rocks are made out of sediments, which is all he's really saying. This isn't a surprise, this isn't evidence of a flood. It's just that that's how sedimentation works. Whether there's a global flood or not. Like, what are the other options? Dinosaur fossils found in layers of cotton fabric? Layers of dry ice? Layers of hydrogen plasma? No, obviously not. Both the flood and science predict that there should be a lot of sedimentary rocks out there, and that it should have fossils. You can't use that on its own to argue for one or the other. You have to use much more specific predictions for both.
Those 3 things, nothing more, nothing less.
Except for all the other things they are in fact buried in.
Go in the middle of Utah, you start digging up dinosaurs. Most of them are, like, for example, the Brushy Basin member.
which is part of the Jurassic Morrison Formation, where I'm from. It's made of interbedded conglomerate and mudstone that has various levels of ash, making it tufaceous, but not actually tough. Also, the Morrison Formation contains siltstone and limestone. You know, things Dan thinks aren't there. Because he thinks only mud, ash, and sand contain fossils. He's just wrong about that, though.
Which is a huge strata of ash. It's just megatons of ash.
There is a lot of ash, but calling it a layer of ash is just incorrect. In some places in the Brushy Basin member, the level of ash rises to 50%, but it is significantly less in most locations. Most of the sediment in the Brushy Basin is not ash.
You'll go some places and find dinosaurs just buried in ash.
Not the Morrison Formation, though, including the Brushy Basin member.
In other cases, it's mud, sand, and ash.
Yes, like in his only cited example.
But it's safe to say that a lot of the dinosaurs in America are buried in those three things. So
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it.
Get on with it!
how do you get ash and mix it up with mud and sand and bury millions of dinosaurs?
Volcanoes. Volcanoes push ash into the air. Ash fall. If it falls in a place that doesn't otherwise have any ongoing sedimentation, it can turn into tuff. If it falls in a place where there is ongoing sedimentation, then that ash will be added to the sediment and you'll get a tuffaceous rock that's a mix of ash and whatever else was being deposited. Floods are in no way required for this, only volcanoes. Heck, you don't even need water. If the ash falls in a place where there is wind-borne sand, it can form a tuffaceous subaerial sandstone. Further, let's not forget that most of the tuff in North America is subaerial tuff. That means it fell onto dry land, not into floodwaters. Once again, we see the reasons that Dan wants us to believe in the flood are actually good reasons to reject the flood. It's like there's a theme here.
Well, it takes something like catastrophic plate tectonics.
No, it doesn't, and we can tell because volcanoes still erupt today, depositing ash in various places, including in things like lakes, rivers, and seas that are depositing sediment right now. The creationist favorite volcano, Mount St. Helens, did that. If you do a sample of the sediment at the bottom of Spirit Lake at the foot of the volcano, you will find an ashy deposit there. You might notice that while there was a volcanic eruption of the mountain in 1980, plate tectonics wasn't in overdrive, and the continents weren't moving at nearly 1 kilometer per hour. More like 3 centimeters per year. The idea that you can't get tough or tuffaceous sedimentary rock without catastrophic plate tectonics is contradictory to the creationist claims about Mount St. Helens.
So you have subducting plates are causing subduction-related volcanism on the sides of the continents, blowing up all this ash. Here, for example, we have the Independence Dyke Swarm. It's a 375-mile linear rift zone in the Los Angeles region. Here's an overlay of it.
All of that remains true without putting the rate of tectonic activity at about 4 billion times faster than what it's ever been known to be, which is what catastrophic plate tectonics is. It's an error of 7 orders of magnitude, which I guess is pretty typical for creationists.
Evolutionists admit that that Independence Dyke Swarm blew out 4,000 cubic miles of ash.
What does he mean by admit? Who has ever thought that was a problem? Volcanic activity puts ash into the air. This isn't something that is a problem for evolution. What is he talking about? If you understand the argument he's trying to make, put it in the comments.
And look, here's the Brushy Basin member of ash, and we can fly that in looking over Utah and Colorado. Look where all that ash is and where it came from.
Yep, the Independence Dyke Swarm is a series of intrusive igneous features that formed in the Jurassic and throughout much of the late Jurassic spewed ash into the air from time to time, resulting in much of the sediment deposited at the time being mixed with ash. This is in fact why the Brushy Basin member is characterized by significant amounts of ash, even though usually less than half of the sediment is ash. It's even true that this is caused by subduction of the Pacific Plate under the North American Plate, even though earlier Dan seemed to say that the subduction should be happening on the same side of the continent as the seafloor is spreading, and this is the opposite side.
How do you fill parts of several states with ash layers if you don't have rapid subduction that's causing the rifting and the volcanism from Southern California?
Normal subduction. You see, the crust that's subducting under the North American Plate brings with it sediment and water, no matter how fast it's subducting. This material has a much lower melting temperature than the rocks of the mantle, and so it forms pools of liquid hot magma under the North American Plate. These build up pressure and seek out any structural weakness in the rock above, flowing up to relieve the pressure. When enough pressure builds up, it can break through the rock, causing an eruption. This will spew ash into the air, often many kilometers up into the air. The ash is carried by the prevailing winds to other locations, where it eventually will fall out of the air.
When I was a teenager and the Mount St. Helens blew up, that quote little volcanic system, it burped out enough ash to cover 3 states and darken the skies for 3 days.
Yes, and it didn't require catastrophic plate tectonics. I don't know if Dan knows this, but the year of our Lord 1980 is a bit after when he thinks the flood happened.
And that only put out 1/4 of 1 cubic mile of ash. So Mount St. Helens covers 3 states with ash for 3 days, can't even see the sun. The Independence Dyke Swarm, during the flood, puts out 4,000 cubic miles of ash.
Dan is just begging the question. That's only an impressive number if you think it all had to happen in the space of a few months. It actually happened over the course of hundreds of thousands of years minimum. But science doesn't indicate that the Independence Dyke Swarm erupted one time and then shut off forever. Again, Dan is begging the question.
That's how you buried the dinosaurs, and the proof that they're buried in ash and mud and sand indicates that the mechanisms that produced those 3 products was happening concurrently.
Yes, as happens now. Rocks weather into sand particles, sediment gets mixed into the water, and volcanoes erupt all the time. It's not like this is a tabletop role-playing game where everyone needs to roll initiative to see whether the volcano or the river can go next. Does Dan think that outside of the flood, volcanoes pause wind and rain and the flow of rivers? Unless he does, I don't see how he can possibly think that this is a good argument. Okay, everyone. You all know the triangle meme that says that a creationist can be a well-informed, honest, and creationist at most too? Tell me whether you think Dan is well-informed and dishonest, or ill-informed but honest. Put it in the comments. Not just because of he's the algorithm god, but also because I'm curious.
That's the number one takeaway I want you guys to have, is that the only way you can bury these dinosaurs over hundreds of thousands of square miles in those 3 products is you have to have mechanisms producing those 3 things at the same time.
Yeah, that's true. But just go outside and then note that sometimes volcanoes make the news. Boom, that's all the mechanisms you need, and they're all going on. Has Dan just never touched grass in his life? Is that what's going on? How does he not see that there are continuous mechanisms producing sediment right now, and that any ash that falls into them will be incorporated into any layers they form? How does anyone think this is compelling?
And the only thing that explains that, the only mechanism that's going to pull that off, is catastrophic plate tectonics.
That's weird, because I live in a world that pulls off simultaneous sedimentation and volcanism every single day, and yet that is not undergoing the ocean boiling nonsense of catastrophic plate tectonics.
That was happening during the flood.
Or that could have, if it wouldn't have turned the flood into a steam bath.
So here's an example of all of those, the ash-producing volcanics that have happened. We have Mount St. Helens is that little tiny block way off to the right, little quarter cubic mile of ash, and we have the Independence Dyke Swarm.
Which isn't a single eruption, making this whole diagram very misleading. Dyke swarms can erupt over the course of hundreds of thousands of years. So divide that volume by 100,000 and the daily ash output of the Dyke Swarm is actually much lower than Mount St. Helens, whose eruption lasted only about 9 hours. You can't just compare the total volume of the volcanic output and then conclude that the eruptions release energy at a rate that's directly proportional to the volume of the debris. It's trivially easy to show that a lower rate of released material and energy over a longer time can result in more total energy and debris released into the environment, all without being part of the cause of a global catastrophe. Creationists really struggle to understand time, just like flat earthers struggle to understand 3 spatial dimensions.
Happening during the flood, blowing out 400,000 cubic miles of ash. That's why we have ash burying the dinosaurs, but they're buried with mud and sand. So it was happening concurrently at the same time.
As predicted by actual geology, which also has the advantage of not breaking any laws of physics, unlike catastrophic plate tectonics. Dan's inability to comprehend the world around him isn't evidence that his favorite interpretation of his favorite book is the real history of the world.
So there's Mount St. Helens, and when we dig up these dinosaurs and we really study dinosaur taphonomy, this is the 3 things that we find. We've got mud that's coming in from the tsunamis that are coming in from the west to the east.
Well, no, because none of this is actually in tsunamite. It's in things like fluvial mudstone, which precludes a catastrophic origin for the mud, meaning that this is simply incorrect.
Sand is the ocean floor. That's all those products are being blown in as well from the catastrophic rifting that's happening.
Sand occurs all over the place, and in fact, much of the sandstone in the fossil record is actually aeolian. That means that it was made of fancy mayonnaise, or that it was deposited by the wind above the water.
And we have the ash that's happening from the subduction of the new seafloor that's diving underneath the land continents.
As opposed to the sea continents, I guess? But yeah, we don't need the tectonics to be catastrophic to get volcanoes, as evidenced by their existence and continuing activity to this very day. Indeed, as I sit here writing this, the Smithsonian is tracking 46 erupting volcanoes around the world.
So it's a trifecta of trifectas happening that's perfectly explained by seafloor subduction that had to be rapiding.
Remember, the only reason it has to be rapid is because without begging the question, this argument is obviously wrong. Dan has to rely on a logical fallacy to even give the appearance that he knows what he's talking about.
Happening rapidly because it's diving underneath the land continents, causing all that irritation, all that subduction. It's coming up, and that's what's generating all of the ash. And it's those three products we find the dinosaurs buried in.
No, it's not. In fact, his example of the brushy basin member of the Morrison Formation isn't all ash and sand and mud. It's actually conglomerate and ash and mud. After this, he's going to zoom in on the Morrison Formation, and I think that is best dealt with next time. I don't think I can keep doing this for my own sanity in one episode. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. And remember to check out The World of Colony by Hexahedron. I'm still not sponsored by them.
I just think they're neat.
I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Hovind, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Ella Runteller, Horseflesh, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostock Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, Wallace, John Ackerman, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.